Greetings, Sardi from Artifact Electronics. I've been having a hard time finding a subject for videos lately, so I went to my last resort again and started searching around my garage. And I've used that explanation a couple times before, and some people may wonder and say, is that a garage you're going through or a barn, because you seem to find something every time. But the reason for that is usually when I search in the garage, where I have many boxes, is when I start searching and I find something, I immediately abort the search and bring the newly found items to the lab and start making a video of them. This time though, it's not, there isn't a whole lot left. I made a list of a couple of items that are still there, but I found this. My last resort is kind of gone, but at least I found this, which is a Commodore 64 with a 1541 floppy disk drive, 5 1/4 inch. And it was a popular computer because at the time it was cheap. It was like $500 or $600 and sported an amazing 64 KB of memory. I got started with a Radio Shack Model 1 computer, and even though it also had a 5 1/4 inch drive, but it wasn't exactly, loading times weren't fast, but they weren't ridiculously slow either, because they used a parallel bus. But on the Atari 800 and on the Commodore 64, they used a serial bus for the disk drive, and because of FCC regulations that limited RF emissions, they went to a really low speed. I don't know exactly what it is, but it takes a really long time to load stuff off the drive, and let me demonstrate that. I found some software along with it, and what better candidate than Ghostbusters, which I'm trying to see what year this was from. It doesn't say, but probably mid-80s, so let's insert that. Turn on the drive, and computer itself, of course, which identifies itself as Commodore 64 Basic version 2, 64K RAM system, blah blah blah. And to demonstrate the loading on this, let me set up a timer here, and let's use the extremely friendly user interface to load the disk. So we type in load. How'd this go? Quote, asterisk, quote, comma, 8, comma, 1. And off we go. This is going to take a while. So I bought this thing, this whole setup, a few years ago. And I was actually going out to buy an Atari 800 computer, and the seller had this Commodore too, and he absolutely insisted that I take the whole lot. And I mean, this stuff was really cheap at the time. For this whole setup on the desk, I probably paid like, I mean, for the computer and the disk drive, I probably paid like $15. And he threw in a bunch of disks and all sorts of stuff. So I got it, I looked at it. It had a modification on it, which we will get into, but it basically got put in the garage, came in the original boxes, which I still have, and so today I thought I'd take it out and would have a look at this thing, see how slow it is, check out the mod, and do a miniature teardown on it, and briefly go through the innards of these two devices and see what's going on. Yeah, it's taken some time, so it's kind of interesting how vintage electronics can make an electronics alchemist out of all of us. All you got to do is buy vintage electronics as cheaply as you can, store them away, wait a few years, and they turn into gold. Well, not really gold, but the prices on these have risen quite a bit. If you check on eBay or with local sellers, And they've also become quite rare, which is people are holding on to them, or whoever was going to throw them away has thrown them away, and now everybody hangs on to these things. So is it worth keeping these? I mean, for me it is. These are pieces of history. A lot of the older generation earned their spurs working with these computers, so it's definitely worth keeping them and keeping them in operating condition. But yes, you're going to get old waiting for this thing just to load something for you. And I hope something will happen soon here. What else can I tell you about this? I don't have the figures in front of me. Commodore sold a whole bunch of these because they were like $500 or $600. And with the princely memory of 64K, it was a no-brainer, because if you bought an S100 system or anything other at the time, it would cost you several $1,000s. And this thing just hooked up to your TV, and you could program it. There was a whole lot of information out in the wild about this. So we are approaching 3 minutes now, and the drive just stopped. Oh, it started up again. Alright, so I stopped the timer a little late, but what the hell? Let's just say 3 minutes flat, because it started already playing the Ghostbuster stuff. But we'll say that the standard load time was 3 minutes, which is 180 seconds. So now, let's go ahead and have a look at the modification. The modification is supposed to speed up disk load times dramatically. Well, it's supposed to speed up disk load times. And the way you invoke it is there's a toggle switch on this. This was already installed. This came with the machine. And it was unlabeled, but after experimenting it, and looking what this modification is supposed to be called, you just flip the toggle switch over to the left, and it's labeled Jiffy because the modification is called Jiffy DOS. And by flipping that switch, you're switching in a different page or a different region of the ROM inside. And when you start it up, it comes up, but instead of identifying itself as Commodore DOS, it is now Jiffy DOS version 6.01, copyright 1983 by CMD. And there is a similar switch on the back of this drive, which I'll flip over. We'll look at the switch later on. Turn on the drive. We still have the Ghostbusters disc in there. So let's go ahead and reset the clock. Type in our load command. So there you go. Well, if you type in the load command wrong, then obviously it doesn't work. So LOAD asterisk 81. Okay, this time we got it right. Now, the Jiffy DOS stuff is kind of interesting because I guess it came out in '89, and then there was like it sold for a while, and there was a long vacuum where you couldn't actually buy it anymore. A whole bunch of people put the binaries on their websites, but that was really pirating because somebody owned the rights to this. And just because somebody doesn't want to sell you something doesn't mean you can just steal it. Now, recently some company has taken over the reins and is selling this again. If you do a search for Jiffy, Commodore 64's Jiffy, you'll find it. And I would highly recommend that you don't use illegal binaries, but if you want this for your Commodore, go out and buy a copy. I'm a software author myself, and how many times have I been handed a copy of my own software with the copy protection broken? It's very unpleasant. So if you want this, go and buy it. It's probably like $30 or $35. So stay legal with software, even if the stuff's over 30 years old. So we have a load time of 1:15. I was a little bit late again. So let's call it a minute. I don't know, we shaved off 5 seconds on the last one, so let's call it a 1:10, which equates to 70 seconds. And if we remember, the last load took 180 seconds. So we achieved a speed up of almost a factor of 3 by using the Jiffy DOS on it. When you're dealing with these kind of load times, that is significant. Which, oh man, that is annoying. Thank you. Even though I usually try to keep my vintage equipment as original as possible, and I briefly considered removing the Jiffy update in here and the switches on the side and all of that. But you know, after running this test, it's with a 3-to-1 speed update, I think it's worth leaving it in because it actually makes the computer somewhat useful. And if I ever decide to write any new code on this and have to start dealing with disk drives and saving and loading or whatever, it's probably a good thing to keep this mod in, and thus I will keep this mod inside. Well, let's have a look and see what's inside of this. Now, I looked around my own library and I have a lot of printed copies of information, and I know that most of this is probably available in one form or another online, but I like printed things. So anyway, what I do have is the actual user's guide, which came with it, the disk drive guide, user's guide, which also came with it, and then in my own bunch of stuff I found the Commodore Programmer's Reference Guide, which really is a technical manual for it because it actually has schematics in the back. Another printing of that, which I think looks pretty similar to the previous one, but it does include the Commodore 64C, and this one didn't have a schematic in the back. Oh, it does. Same schematic in the back, so that's the same book as before. A real relic is this book, which I actually was forced to use in one of my hardware classes while I was an undergraduate. It's held together with packing tape, barely, but I learned how to program 6502, which the Commodore uses a derivative of, from this book. And finally, another technical manual. This is really neat because it actually has a commented listing of the ROM in here. Let's see, where does that start? Starting over here, and of course going on with actual comments of what everything does. And yeah, the only downside for some people may be that this is in German, so if you don't speak German, this would be somewhat useless to you. But I do, so this is actually really useful to me. Now, enough talk, and let's take its clothes off. There are 5 screws underneath that you remove, and it is basically hooked in on the back. So you just lift this off, and there's the keyboard connector here, and there's the LED connector here, and that frees it up. So let's see if we can get a better picture of this. So here you go, here's the innards, and I'm going to use one of the schematics. One interesting thing to note in here is that in the history of talking about Commodore, whenever people talk about the kernel, it is always misspelled with an A instead of an E. Like it's such as, and this is the reason for it, because kernel was misspelled in the official schematics. The whole community started calling the kernel the kernel, as it is in here, and that has kind of persisted. But here's the source of that. So, jumping into this, here are the three ROMs: a character ROM, a basic ROM, and the kernel ROM over here. And this contains the Jiffy DOS modification, and it basically has two images in it. And the original part is a 2364, which is which is basically a 2764 EEPROM. Now, in order to fit two 8K images here, you have to go to the next size EEPROM, which was a 27128. And the 27128 is housed in a 28-pin package rather than a 24-pin package. So the way this was done, and it's done actually pretty cleanly. Let's see if I can get this in. It's basically a wire wrap socket was mounted offset into the empty spot of the original ROM, and of course the extra 4 pins are floating in the air and are connected via 30 gauge wire wrap wires, but there are some other pins that have been cut and so that they could be rerouted. And I think the way that whole thing works is we have the switch over here, which essentially is connected between ground and one of the pins here. And what I suspect they're doing, there should be a resistor here somewhere acting as a pull-up, and I can't see it right now, but essentially the way it works is when this switch is in the off position, then, actually no, when it's in this position it shorts the white wire to ground, which means, and looking at the schematic, is that address pin A13 is thus grounded, and when you're running this, it's it's using the lower 8K image housed in here. But when you flip the switch over, it disconnects the ground, and that's why I was looking for a pull-up. There should be a pull-up in here somewhere. So now address line 13 is pulled high, and the second image is used, which most likely consists, not most likely, but does contain the Jiffy DOS image. And that's why you gotta, it's not hot switchable. That's why you gotta turn it off and turn it back on again, because if you flip the switch while it's on, the processor's gonna get confused, something horrible. But looking at this again, here's a cartridge connector, controller interface over here, and a manly fuse here. None of these through-hole tiny fuses or surface mount fuses. Easy to replace. That's not a problem in these. Caps that probably need to be replaced. There's a 12 volt and a 5 volt regulator. We have the RF modulator over here, and probably some of the video stuff is sitting under this cage, and the reason it's sitting under the cage is again because of to keep RF emissions in check. Can't see it right here, but there's a RF shield that covers the entire bottom of the board, but unlike other computers, I guess this one didn't have an RF shield on top, so they shielded the video part over here. And 64K of dynamic memory with multiplexing circuitry in front of it. Here's the actual processor, which is labeled as a 6510. It's a 6502 where some of the pin functionalities have changed from the standard 6502. Of course, here's the 3 ROMs, 2 parallel interface adapters over here that read the keyboard and probably have all the controller stuff routed to them. And other than that, the most interesting part is the 6581 by MOS Technology. And what that is it's a sound chip. So the sound chip, I mean, it's a digital sound chip. It does some envelopes and this and that. But for some reason, the people are enamored with that chip. And I think many Commodore 64 consoles have lost their usefulness because people want this chip, which I haven't checked lately, but the chip was like $50 or $60. Just this chip, and people put them into custom enclosures and built drivers for them and made music with them. And I personally don't get it because why did you need to rip the thing apart if you wanted to hear 8-bit square waves? There's many vintage computers around, but hey, what do I know? And I think that has also contributed to the scarcity, the relative scarcity of Commodore 64s, because they ran out of the supply of these chips very soon after people discovered it. So people started taking apart Commodore 64s, taking out this chip, and then, well, it would still boot up, but it'd have no sound and be essentially useless. And I suspect that a lot of these got chucked after the sound chip was removed from them. But that's it. It's a very basic setup, no big mysteries in here, and it's marked 1983 Commodore International, Commodore 64. This is a Rev A board, and that's all she wrote for the computer itself. Next we have the drive. You can kind of see the toggle switch sticking over here. You take a few screws out the bottom and top lid just lifts off. There's the switch. And there's a shield over the PCB which has 2 screws in it, which I removed. This thing's heavy. Take it off, and you can see the 5 1/4 inch drive underneath. And this has a much beefier power supply over here. It still uses 12 volts and 5 volts, but it's got these 3 amp regulators over here. And the Jiffy DOS install over here is, now the versions are different. This is basically DOS 2.6, which is the standard DOS, and Jiffy DOS is version 5.0, which is different from what's in the processor. And same kind of setup with the offset wire wrap socket in here to house a 27128. This has an actual 6502 in it. Where is it? Over here. Then it has 2 6522 parallel interface adapters. And this is most likely the disk controller chip over here. And it's got a 2016 RAM here. So as far as computing power is concerned, it probably has very similar computing power to the actual computer with the 6502 in there, but it has less RAM. It only has 2K RAM over here because I guess that's all it needs. Then it has a serial chip over here that is used to connect to the serial I/O bus, and that's about it, because the drive extends to about here, and this one is copyright 1982. 2. And that's basically what the drive looks like. Finally, I was curious about what these two shielded boxes were for. And okay, one of them contains a 16 meg crystal, a TTL style crystal, and this one just contains a counter. But I guess, again, in order to satisfy FCC regulations, they enclose them in cages. Well, I guess, the crystal one makes sense. I'm not so sure that counter makes sense, but I guess it's driven directly by the crystal. So it oscillates at a pretty high frequency, and at one point in time, I guess they thought it was necessary to enclose these in RF cages. And that's the inside of the drive. It's kind of interesting because the complexity of the drive electronics are not far behind the complexity, if complexity is the right word to use, of course, of the electronics in the console itself. But, that's what they had to go through to create a working unit. So I went ahead and buttoned up everything. But I noticed that when I was using this LCD monitor, it is probably was really hard to read, if not near impossible to read what the screen was saying. So I decided to take out my panoramic monitor over here so you can catch a better view of the beautiful graphics that this puts out. So I tried this out, and it looked like I ran into another problem because this guy wouldn't display any video. I would take the RCA plug it into the LCD, and the video would show up. And then I would unplug it from there and plug it in here, and nothing would show up. Now, I'm not really eager to take this thing apart again. This was fixed in an early video, and it's not one of my favorite devices to fix, but it looked like there was something wrong with the video on this thing. But before tearing into it, I do have another candidate sitting behind it, the Nintendo 64. I thought, let's give that a try first, before going down the wormhole of tearing the monitor apart again. So once that got connected, and it works fine. So that was quite a mystery to me. Why wouldn't it work? I mean, I had done my fault isolation. Obviously, this was emitting video. The LCD monitor was showing the video, but this guy wasn't showing the video. It was playing the Commodore sounds, but no video. And so basically at this point, I was at a deadlock with fault isolation until I noticed something really interesting. And that was, here's the cable. Here's the RCA ends of the cable that I was using. And yeah, I stared at them a couple times and I couldn't see anything bad until I compared the RCA plugs to another cable I had. And look at that. The prong is at least twice as long as it is on the cable that I used. So it simply didn't show video because the video prong, which was the black one, just didn't reach in far enough. It was hanging in midair when plugged into the Sony, but for some reason the LCD had a different kind of connector that did make contact with it. So the weirdest things can go wrong, and this one, it did take me a while to find the problem here, and I was honestly getting ready to tear this guy apart and see what was wrong with it, but it was this cable here, and I don't know why you would have these stupid short RCA connectors, but I'm not going to keep these around to find out, or to have to run into this problem again a couple of years down the road and have to wonder why that thing isn't working. This console, of course, has a cartridge port on the back, as I mentioned, and it's right here. And I have some cartridges for it. But there's one odd thing I noticed on the cartridge. So here's a cartridge. Jungle Hunt by Atari Soft. And I never really realized this, but I said, wait a minute. The biggest competitor to the Commodore 64 was the Atari 800, 400 line of computers. Apple didn't really come into the picture because Apple was going after the business market. Apple was more expensive. So basically Commodore and Atari were fighting it out. So why would Atari take a popular arcade game that is theirs and make it run on the Commodore? The obvious answer is, yeah, let's generate some revenue and sell cartridges. But didn't anybody think that they were increasing the popularity of this console by making Atari games available for it? Atari also did this for the TI computer, the 99/4A. They put Atari games out on that. So having no business or marketing background, I never fully understood that approach by Atari, and I stopped thinking about it a few years later when Atari basically went out of business. But if you have any enlightening insights, please leave me a comment, because I always found that curious. So let's go ahead and plug in Jungle Hunt, which actually is plugged in. Turn it on, and for that we're going to need a joystick. So here's an original Atari joystick, and the side it has two joystick connectors, and so the game starts up, and I think I found another problem, because when I hit the button it goes back to the title screen. So what this button does is toggles between starting the game and going back to the title screen. It just doesn't want to cooperate. Remember in the beginning I said, oh, there's nothing wrong with it? Well, there was nothing wrong with it at that time, it seems, but with the video cable, now with this problem, I'm beginning to get a little bit annoyed. But I figured this one out also, finally, and that was, I remembered this from long ago, that even though it has controller ports marked 1 and 2, a lot of games made you use controller port number 2. That's because of how the controller ports were wired, and there were some data lines that were being reused in multiple places and stuff like that. So in order to fix that, I unplug it from controller port 1 and plug it into controller port 2. And now using the F1 key, I can actually go in and start the game. And hitting the button no longer takes me back to the title screen, but rather lets me play this wonderful game. Ouch. But anyway, that's, that is this game. So it does work, everything does work in it, as long as you're aware of the idiosyncrasies of RCA plugs that are too short, and controller ports where you're not supposed to use controller port 1, but rather number 2. You would think the game would detect something like that and give you a heads up, but it didn't. So it was kind of rough at the time. You had to be rather ingenious to take a fully working device and make it perform for you. We do need a final demo, and looking through the box of discs, I found this beautiful disc here Musicalc Christmas Hits. Isn't that one of the coolest 5 1/4 inch discs you've ever seen? Even has the instructions on the back. That is actually cool. But remember we talked about the sound chip and how people are paying lots of money for it? Well, let's see what it sounds like. So, put this thing in. We're set to jiffy mode on both ends. And the way you invoke this, I guess I need to remove Jungle Hunt, turn them back on again, and say load hits 8.1. Device not present. Oh, that's because device is not plugged in. Well, now it is. Isn't there like an F3 key that repeats the command? I guess not. So back to load hits 8.1. Well, there you go. Okay. Says up arrow for menu, or does it mean up on the controller? Let me plug the controller back in. Oh, there you go. Oh, it's playing. Yes, the screen is blank. I guess all the processing power is taken up in generating square waves. I mean, this is true genius. People really utilize the sound capabilities in this well, and now it makes sense to me why people would be paying $50 or $60 just to get the sound chip out of this. Are we done? Okay, thank you. All right, we're all packed up and ready to go into stasis for another 5 or 10 years or whatever. As a point of interest, this has a price sticker of $199 on it, and this one $149. So it was about in the middle of the life of this series when these were purchased by whomever purchased them, and was nice enough to keep the boxes around. And of course, when you get your brand new Commodore 64 and you opened it for the first time, this is what greeted you. Welcome to the world of friendly computing. As compared to, oh well, I hope you enjoyed this, and I sure did. I hadn't touched this thing in a long time, and you know, they'll always throw you a curveball, and this one threw me too. But anyway, if you enjoyed it, make sure to leave a thumbs up, and of course, subscribe, so you won't miss any of the future excitement we're going to show on this channel. Bye.